Hi everyone, this is Professor Hall, and today we are talking about The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is part of our Golden Age of Children's Literature series, and I'm super excited to dive into this book. There's a lot of historical things going on in the background, so we're going to talk about historical and cultural contexts, and we're going to get into some of the book's themes as well, and some comparisons to another novel earlier in the Victorian period. This is written in the Edwardian period, Jane Eyre. So we'll look at all of that. So first, a bit about the author. Burnett was born in Manchester, England, after her father's death in 1853. Her mother really attempted to save his business and ran it herself for a while, and essentially she and the children had to move into a succession of smaller and smaller houses. So basically the family was facing poverty, and Burnett's mother had other family in Tennessee, and that is where they moved in 1865. So it's kind of interesting because some people consider her a British writer and some people consider her an American writer, and really she's both, right? She was born in Britain and lived there her entire childhood before moving to the United States, and then traveled quite a bit, especially when her writing brought her some income. So she began writing at a young age in order to support her family. You can think of this sort of similar to Louisa May Alcott, writing short stories and having those published and getting money for them. And basically this habit of writing was her profession, but she became extremely obsessive about it. She would write for long periods of time. She always seemed to be worried about falling back into poverty, and because of this faced exhaustion several times during her life, just kind of getting really burned out. She married Swan Burnett in 1873. They had two sons, Lionel and Vivian. Lionel died of tuberculosis in 1890, which obviously deeply affected her. And actually, her younger son, Vivian, also had some sort of illness that back then they just sort of said it was a brain fever, and almost didn't make it as well around that same time period. So she almost lost her other son too. She lived mostly apart from her husband. We're going to talk about her writing in a moment. Essentially, when her literary career took off, she was the main breadwinner in the family, and so she would just send money home, and she and her boys would travel. She lived with Lionel for quite some time, trying to cure his tuberculosis, and unfortunately, the efforts to save him did not work. So she did not want to divorce him because she thought it would hurt her literary career, especially because by that point she was more famous for writing for children, although she did write for adults as well. But her husband met someone else eventually. So after 25 years of this marriage where they were mostly separated, she agreed to divorce. Then she met this other man, Stuart Townsend, in 1900. He was incredibly obsessive, demanded large amounts of money from her, would sort of stalk her and show up at literary events to try to embarrass her, and so she would give him money, and eventually she was able to divorce him as well in 1902. Her writing style, as I said, she wrote for both children and adults. Her first novel was That Lass o' Lowry's, and it was really well received, but her true breakthrough came with Little Lord Fauntleroy in 1886. This was a cultural phenomenon, and I think this is interesting because she really for a long time was associated with this book that I think most modern readers have not read. But it involves a little boy whose father passes away. He lives in America, and after the death of his father, he finds out that he is now set to inherit a large estate in England. And so he and his mother travel to England, and then they learn, he learns lessons along the way and all of that. So it's a little bit of a fish out of water story. And for whatever reason, I think part of it's the title. I think if we had a different title, it wouldn't sound quite so old fashioned. It could be that, sometimes girls are more likely to read books today, and so we have The Little Princess and the Secret Garden as her more enduring works. Her books were often serialized, so they were put into magazines, especially magazines for children. The American is one where she would write basically episodes, right? Parts of chapters, and Charles Dickens wrote a lot of his work in serial form, and many authors of this time period did as well. And focusing a lot on transformation, resilience, the healing power of nature, things we're going to talk about more when we get into the book itself. And her faith is kind of central to this writing that she did, the transformative power of kindness, positive thinking, compassion. She had some Christian Scientist beliefs, which is a group that does not believe in taking medicine, but rather healing through really looks at illness as psychological and spiritual rather than just physical. And her writing carried these moral messages, but unlike earlier didactic stories, she doesn't preach at children. She doesn't allow the moral to overtake the storytelling elements. So if you're in my class, we looked at Water Babies briefly, not the whole thing because that book is sort of insufferable, but that book where we have long passages of people just going on and moralizing to the end of day, and having, these long breaks where the narrator tells us how we should feel. That's not how her stories are written. So, for example, with Secret Garden, we don't have here's how Mary should be behaving, and isn't she a naughty child? Instead, we're allowed to see Mary misbehaving. We're allowed to see her as she slowly changes and embraces things like love and friendship. Ultimately, Burnett's style is this really interesting mix to me because the realism that we see is very American, if you see our lectures on Tom Sawyer. But then we have some fairy tale elements and some fantasy, and magical realism, which is really more like British sensibilities. And most of her stories are set there. At least The Secret Garden is that we're looking at. And her books resonated with children as well as adult readers. So those are some of the reasons that she was so popular. And really at this time, you can see her in her dress here with her fan, quite a celebrity in literary circles, and the paparazzi, so to speak, at that time would follow her around a bit, especially after her scandalous divorces. So if you haven't read The Secret Garden yet, here's a little bit of an overview so you have a better understanding of what we're going to be talking about. Mary Lennox is a spoiled, neglected girl. She is raised in British India. So that is where we begin our story. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Her parents die in a cholera outbreak, and she is sent to live with her reclusive uncle, Archibald Craven, at Misselthwaite Manor in Yorkshire, England. So to me, this is interesting in and of itself because a lot of adventure stories for children would be the opposite. We would be going from a normal sort of, not normal, but an everyday location. You can think about Peter Pan being in the nursery on a normal street, right? In a middle class sort of boring, as Barry puts it, a dreary neighborhood. Here, we're going from a place that was sort of exoticized in a lot of literature with India, and moving from there to this rural location. So that's sort of interesting to note there. The manor, though, is vast. It's mysterious. There are locked rooms. There are secrets. There's some gothic elements here. We have a moor that withers, and the moaning on the moor. And Mary soon hears about a hidden garden which was locked away after her aunt's death. She becomes friends with Martha, who is a maid in the house. was really one of the first people to show her kindness. She also befriends a gardener who really is quite a Yorkshire man and does not really want to be befriended at first and is kind of a gruff manner. And then we also meet Dickon, Martha's brother, a boy with a really deep connection to nature, and together they sort of discover and restore this garden. She also befriends Colin Craven, her sickly cousin, who believes he is doomed to die young. And essentially, through fresh air and friendship and positive thinking, Mary heals from her trauma, and Colin gradually begins to regain some of his health. So you can see over here, Mary, Dickon, and Colin with the crow. And then over here is a stage version. This is from the earlier film from the 1930s or 40s, and then this is from a play. So it's still quite popular today. The still from the play is quite recent, still performed for kids. So let's get into a little bit of the background of this story. I want to talk about really the industrialization of Britain at this time and why stories that were set in these rural locations were quite so popular. So we have, these are London being industrialized. This is a painting that was done in the Victorian period. Here are children, workers, and then this is a tighter view of a very small flat in London and a woman trying to wash clothes while her children are sort of playing in this very cramped space. I put these pictures up so that you can get a really good picture of just how bad it had sort of gotten in these urbanized areas in the Victorian period, and then even really into the Edwardian period, which is what we're looking at with this book. So was why was England being urbanized, and why did we have this move to urban areas? Before, in the 1700s, British farming had been historically done on this, what was called an open field system, and I've got a picture of it in a moment. Each farmer had the right to sort of plant crops on strips of land in the open fields. Sometimes you would have the gentry, the landed gentry, who would own very large estates and then would have farmers that worked for them, working the land, or they would rent out the land. So basically, the farmers would graze their animals in the village common. They would gather firewood in the local waste. There was a squire, usually a local magistrate. The Church of England sometimes would have a vicar in the village appointed by the squire, and they were oftentimes the only literate people in the community. Then, in the mid and late 1700s, we have what's called the enclosure movement. Now, yes, our book is set in 1900s, but you have to kind of understand the history of all of the stuff that went before, I think, to really have a better idea. But basically, we have ambitious landlords consolidating the land, fencing in farms, taking advantage of early machinery, and we have these poor cottagers and the smaller landholders who really didn't have the money to enclose the land, or they lacked the legal proof of their rights. So a lot became landless. Farm laborers, like I said, for the landed gentry, then the wealthier people who owned these larger estates. And the rural poverty was difficult, so many migrated to the growing industrial cities where they could find work. So we see right here, in the 1600s, a lower percent of urban people, and then this shift of the rural population moving to the urban areas, and especially London, and how that kind of grew from this point in time, especially huge amount of growth during the Victorian period, and then right here would be into the Edwardian and middle interwar period. Here is a picture of what this would sort of look like. I'm going to zoom in on it for you guys. There we go. So we have the village here, and we have the field that is open for wheat, the field that is open for barley, the field that is fallow for the animals to graze, and some larger estates. And eventually what would often happen, right, is that all of this gets enclosed, and then we have some more modern farming techniques coming in, which you can see with this guy with the with the harvester. So there were some problems with this open field system. It wasn't just like, all all a utopia out there. One of the problems is nobody could really experiment scientifically. There's problems with drainage and weeds ruining the soil because you don't have anywhere else to go. So there's no like crop rotation system, which is one of the things I mean by experimenting scientifically. How to best grow crops, right? The output of crops was quite low, and it raised quite a bit with the new system. And there was an output of foodstuffs, which allowed Britain even more stability. So into the Victorian period, which starts in 1837, we have this sort of agricultural boom, in part because of the move to have these enclosures. But by the later Victorian period in the 1870s, the gains of the British agricultural productivity are offset by competition because Britain was colonizing everybody, right? Which we'll talk about in a minute. So we have these advances in transportation and other technology. The prairies are being settled in America. Steamships are allowing for easier transport of goods, along with bringing other new things in, new to them at least, from places like India. And these factors led to an agricultural depression in Britain, which started around 1870 and lasted through the period that we are looking at in our book, really up until World War I, which is just slightly after our book takes place. So because of this, we also have urban poverty. Days are controlled by the clock. The urbanization leads to lower and lower wages because there's tons of people coming in looking for jobs. We have this increase in child employment, work in factories and mines, and as we saw with water babies, chimney sweeps. And a member of parliament visited a textile factory in the late 1830s, and he described, and I'm using his terms here, crippled and deformed, but basically children who were injured and had disabilities because they were working so hard in this factory. And he says, no power of language could describe the varieties, and may I say the cruelties in these degradations of the human form. They stood or squatted before me in all shapes of the letters of the alphabet. So really harsh conditions for kids. And then in the later, by around this point, and it's partially why the MP was writing this, we have the growing middle class as well. So some people who were coming up out of these systems who had, a little bit of money, and they are pushing for the restriction of child labor, improving conditions, regulating work hours, compulsory education, which I talked about in another video. And not everybody is in favor of these changes. Wages that children brought in could raise the standard of living for an entire family. And school costs money. And in many cases, we have a tighter caste system or a tighter class system in Britain. And it's hard for children to better their prospects even with education. So that was some of the reasons that some families were fighting against it. So by the early 1900s, a lot of this thankfully changes, and we have things like education compulsory for children. We have a nearing the end of child labor, and we have a lot of child labor laws put into place. But we also have this idea of the urban system and all of these factories as kind of hurting people physically, as we see here, but also spiritually and psychologically. So within my video, I'm going to show you guys this short clip of Modern Times from 1936. It is obviously later than the book that we're looking at, but I think it gives you a good idea of the ways in which people were kind of thinking about how factory life was affecting them. So you see here Charlie Chaplin in kind of a comedic way trying his best to keep up with this assembly line. I'll turn down even a little bit more here so that I can narrate, and hopefully I won't get blocked on YouTube for this. So he's going kind of crazy. There we go. Trying to keep up, doing the same repetitive task over and over, and then symbolically getting sucked into the machinery. I love this. It's so visually arresting, right? But it really, even there, he's doing the same thing, trying to get those widgets, and then he's sucked back out, and the movie continues on from there. But yeah, it's really interesting because it completely symbolizes how these factories were thought of, that you are just part of this machinery, that you're a cog in the wheel, right? And so we have a lot of writers in especially in Victorian Edwardian time and this golden age of childhood, who are trying to return to a simpler time. And they're thinking back of their childhoods, but really even a nostalgia for years before that, where we have more rural, simple life. And so that is something that is going on in our book. Sorry about that, an ad popped up. So we also have this idea of the landed gentry. I mentioned them before. Here's a great picture from a book, The Landed Gentry and Aristocracy of County Wicklow. So the landed gentry were not aristocrats. They were people typically who had come up from the middle class and or began life wealthy, and eventually they enclosed more and more land. They take over and they have these very large estates. So families whose wealth and status came from these extensive land holdings. We also get the term gentrification, right? We're gentrifying a neighborhood, means that wealthier people are coming in, they're changing it, sometimes for the better and sometimes not. It's still a very loaded term today. So this manor that we have in the book, Misselthwaite Manor, really is meant to represent the landed gentry. It's a classic example of an ancestral home. We have a grand but very secluded atmosphere. So the estate is sometimes described as remote, as gloomy. It's this real symbol of the isolation that can come from old wealth, especially when it becomes disconnected from this pulse of everyday life. Mary's uncle is very clearly represented by this house, right? He is still grieving the loss of his wife, a decade later, and he has sort of himself fallen into disrepair. So this idea of the old order, inheriting privilege, having this social hierarchy, and the fact that in many ways that's not working either, I think should be quite apparent. The static nature of tradition, inherited social structures, and that we need rejuvenation. These institutions are sort of decaying, but they don't have to. And we see the same disconnection with Mary's life in India as well. Her family is materially wealthy, but spiritually impoverished. They're disconnected from each other. They're disconnected from her. She is quite spoiled in some ways because of this. And so that's something to look for. So I'm going to end here for right now, but we're going to pick back up and talk about some of the other historical details of this book, looking at India in particular, and we're going to talk about cholera. So it should be exciting. So stay tuned. Thanks, everybody.